Hi, everyone, and welcome to Poets in Conversation. I'm Phyllis Klein, and tonight we have George Looney and Doug Ramspeck. Really amazing poets. So before we start, I did want to say something about the wars that are raging all around the world. And just to mention it, we hope that you are safe where you are. And also to say that temperatures are rising. And we are here for poetry, which I consider to be a beacon of light for dark times and for all times. So tonight we're going to get to spend time with George Looney and Doug Ramspeck, as I said. And they are fellow college educators who met through George's poetry journal, Lake Effect, when George was happy to publish Doug's work and published a lot of it over the years. So this is what Doug says. Why are you writing if you already know what you have to say? I love that. He uses he uses an unconscious process as much as possible when writing poems, and often finds random words to take fascinating leaps. And here are a few examples of that. An epistle of moonlight, um, in the claw grip of the clouds, and cadences of loam. And I hope those are all the leaps that I'm thinking about, Doug, but and they're all in, I just found those in one poem called The Midwest Hangs Itself While Listening to Bobolinks, which I think is going to be very interesting for us to hear and talk about more. So now George Looney, he's going to make us smile while leading us through despair and out the other end to choose kindness to cleanse what he says is inside us, the soul. And that comes from the last poem in his latest book, Early Light in Erie. Both of these men are prolific, as in almost double-digit numbers of books, each book getting stronger and lovelier until they find themselves walking on water of words. That's my thing. It is my great pleasure to be immersed in their poems and to have their wisdom as teachers and friends to gift us with knowledge and inspiration. So I'm going to start with a poem now of mine. And this poem was written on a writing retreat when I was having the lovely thought about the inevitability of bone loss. And it's called Requiem for My Skeleton. I ask myself how to grieve for my bones. I ask myself how to feel them thinning. I ask myself why I don't feel it. I ask myself what I was looking for in the closet of my scaffolding. I ask why it was locked. I ask to say a few words of remembrance for the framework. I ask to sit in a field of butterflies because they don't live long. I ask to break out of this cage. I ask to think of bone broth. I cry. I try matching outside to inside. I support myself. Can I imagine myself stooped over? I ask you to hold my hand as we watch a puff of clouds trek above our bodies and dissolve. Okay, so now George is going to read first, and Doug is going to introduce him. So I will hand things over to Doug.
Okay, thank you. George Looney is the author of 12 full-length collections of poetry, 3 poetry chapbooks, a novel, a novella, and 2 collections of stories. The most recent books include The Visibility of Things Long Submerged, The Acrobatic Company of the Invisible, Birds of Sympathy, Correspondences, and the Itinerant Circus, New and Selected Poems, 1995 to 2020. He is the founder of the BFA in Creative Writing program at Penn State Erie, editor of Lake Effect, translation editor of Mid-American Review, and co-founder of the original Chautauqua Writers Festival. I first came to know George's work when I began writing poetry at the age of 15, and I stumbled across and purchased this book, Attendant Ghost, and it really did have a profound effect on me and my way of thinking about poetry and thinking about poets who can write about the Midwest, which I wanted to do, and that sort of small town life. And I remember, I'll read you just the opening couple lines of a poem that I remember just blew me away and made me really think about poetry in a new way. It comes from a confession of arrows and love. You could die in this bar or be born again, maybe the preacher on the corner who clutches his chest and collapses into chant. A woman could forgive drink and the bitter rasp of your breath asleep if you could hang a solid beam level. So it's thank you, George, for poetry that has meant a lot to me over the last 20 years.
Thank you, Doug. And quite frankly, the only thing I can think to say is I'm honored that my poetry, had an effect on you. And, it's because your poetry definitely is something that I have admired and obviously published for a number of years. Okay, so I'm going to read tonight 7 poems from the new book, The Acrobatic Company of the Invisible, and then 1 newer poem. So the first poem I'm going to read is actually the first poem in the new book. And I don't know why I wrote this down that I was going to say this, but it is actually set in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is where I have lived now for, I believe, 24, almost 25 years. So this poem is titled The Bestowing of Grace in Perry Square. This could be the origin of pointillism. This gazebo fractured by what light can do, left to its own devices. Even grackles hop different in this light, stippled. The misbegotten purple sheen of the mercurial necks, slipping from dull to brilliant again and again. Everything bejeweled this morning, as if remembered. After all, memory bestows grace, the way this speckling of light baptizes the gazebo and the grass and the birds in the grass into a living psalm. Praise what everything was always about. This next poem was not written in Erie. That's all I'll say about that. The title of this one is Soundtrack for Mystery in a Field of Muddy Angels. Cows low miraculous psalms under a callous moon. That's all the light I have in which to see the arches of the faces this music rises out of. Brutish, and yet as graceful as any articulation in paint or plaster of angels. I'm writing to a distant woman. Behind me, inside the house, my wife and her parents are practicing music. A concerto for violin and piano, Mozart put down in a drunken fervor. Long enough ago, the alcohol is gone, and all that remains is the fervor. Mozart must have felt the sort of ache the woman I write to is. The devout lowing of cows in the field across the road seems a proper accompaniment to the raw rendition of Mozart starting up inside the lit-up house I will have to go back into soon. What each of us carries inside us is too awful to be articulated by something as divine as even the most inept music. This next poem is a bit longer. It continues the theme of music. The lyrical prophecies of a Spanish guitar. Late November. The bare limbs of trees want to deny the scuttled urgency of clouds that scurry and seem to compose ballads and old man plays, remembering the nearly forgotten sense of a woman who would sing damp beside him in bed, the strumming of an out-of-tune Spanish guitar, a sad backdrop after love. Nothing can explain the harsh, unforgiving style of this fog. How, despite it being no more than a dampness in what is only the cool of an autumn morning, it's as impatient as something more solid. Say, this woman in earth tones with a son in tow, who can't be more than 7, his frantic hand collapsed inside hers, larger and more insistent. It's almost as if her hand's a Spanish ballad, and his the repeated phrase, a delicate, familial theme. Missing in his are the variations, which always and only come with time. Or is that come as time? The morning fog takes on the images of their passing through it, so that for a frenzied instant, their being in a rush hangs in a series of interlocked and vague tropes of her body that are shivered through again and again by the irregular form of the reluctant boy enslaved to this headlong scurry of flesh and fallen cloud. There's music in this fog, though it's not the lyrical prophecies of a Spanish guitar in tune and strummed by a lover who knows the sturdy instrument like the inflections of his own body, but the hollow sounds of some weathered wind instrument, a music made by someone's shop-worn breath, forced into the confines of a columned space and released in fingered patterns. The music you'd hear standing in front of Hopper's hotel by a railroad. Outside, it might be starting to snow. Here, there's only the indignation of late afternoon light, filtered by residue that leaves a dour patina on the sills of windows that can't be opened. The forgetfulness of how the woman in the slip curls into the inevitability of her body, imbues the austere room with a scent, maybe one the man wants to recall through the stink and nervous ruin of his cigarette. Any music left between them, these figures of lamentation posed in this regret of a rented room, one looking down at the pages of a book she has read enough to turn the words into notes she hums lackadaisically, and the other looking out at tracks that could be staves for a music that could get fog up and dancing. Must be an almost jaunty dirge, all about time, and how to remember any detail ends up elevating loss to the level of the sacred, which is what the Spanish guitar, played by a lover to the beloved, while outside everything's offered a kind of redemption by the laying on of a discordant fog, claims for us all, even if the guitar's out of tune and played poorly, a music to forgive everyone who listens. This next poem is one of 5 in the book of what I call decadent poems, simply meaning each is 10 lines long with each line having exactly 10 syllables. So this one is titled The Girl Who Made Love in Cemeteries. It's the thought of them down there looking up, she said. The shifting shape of our bodies, coming between them and constellations they've whispered the stories of for so long, it seems they have no room for anything more. That's what does it for me, giving them something new to whisper under the earth. Whether flat on my back on a marble headstone, or standing with you behind, me hugging this stone angel for all she's worth. This next poem is where the title of the book comes from. It's a poem that arose out of my experience with my father's dementia. He died of Alzheimer's. This poem is in part memoir, but as Stephen Dunn argued, the more personal the poem, the more it needs to be in part fictive. And so it is. The Consolation of a Company of Acrobats. These children in my father's house. He asks his wife, a woman who is more in this world, why are they here? What is it they want? He asks her, not ready, it seems, to speak to them, to give in completely to them being there. In the old days, we might have called them harbingers. Now the words dementia. We say nothing's there, though we rarely say it to him. Humor him, a friend of the family says. But there's no humor here, only a future bleak and brief. I want to see these children my father sees and do what he can't, to ask them what it is they mean. The gall of it, life. To rob us of all we think of as who we are and offer, as if in compensation, cherubic children who point at us but are invisible. At his best, he knows they don't belong in his house and says so. Other times, he chuckles at the tricks they do, as if they're there to entertain him. Distraction is an art even the most healthy mind practices. To call up children not there, children who are whimsical and who smile at him as they somersault off the couch. Is this compensation for the failure of his eyes? These comic acrobats he can see, even if the rooms they frolic in get darker every day, they're not angels, as his wife tells me she likes to believe they are. Could they be some skewed sliver of memory? Maybe from earlier than memory is supposed to form? Are the darkening rooms he stumbles through, leaning on his cane, the womb? These children, his brothers and sisters, never born? Do they come to make him comfortable with what waits after his body finally gives out? The place where, having been born and lived and died, can't be distinguished from never having been born. If so, maybe his wife has it right. Maybe they are angels, and there's no heaven better than the acrobatic company of the invisible. This is the next to last poem I'll read from the book. And the title is On the Eaves of the House Next Door. The music of sparrows arguing turns at the feeder is enough to get this hunkering ghost, who had forgotten the world had music in it, to hum some tune Sinatra made his own. Set to motion by the subtle, almost music rising out of what used to be his throat, the ghost dances a waltz, elaborate enough to make him grin. How much can the presence of a grinning ghost mean to the fragrant woman refilling the feeder and singing to the sparrows perched on neighboring trees or the eaves of the house next door, expectant and nervous? The ghost is taken with the woman and wants to ask her to join him and Sinatra in the dance. The lights angle just enough for her to convince herself the insubstantial figure of a man is stuttering beside her, holding out his hand as if to offer to swing her into some aberrant waltz the music of sparrows makes possible. If she takes the ghost's hand, would any one of us driving by on our way home be cruel enough or broken enough to deny her the pleasure of such a waltz on a day the light is skewed enough we might see a dead lover grinning in the passenger seat, and believe if we just keep on driving, we'll find a place to pull off and park and make love with the one who has always been there in the midst of any passion? Let this woman waltz with the sparrows. Let that waltz make everything possible. So this is the last of the poems I'll read from the Acrobatic Company, The Invisible, and it's the last poem in the book. And the title is Early Light in Erie. Morning, reflected, assumes these buildings the way gulls assume the ambivalent sky at the edge of the bay blocks north. The chatter of gulls here is less cacophony and more a lonesome blues riff strummed lazy on an acoustic guitar salvaged from a dusty secondhand shop for less than $10. All that's constructed dissolves in this light. All movements a huddling together, an embrace, romantic. A woman throws stale bread to gulls and the rock doves we call pigeons, and the birds ignore each other in the rush and stuttering of wings. Give us this day our daily bread, this woman says, having chosen kindness. I'd like to say this early light has chosen to illuminate these buildings. That every music, whether composed or the result of a moment's collusion of disparate sounds, is an urgent declaration of compassion, instinctual or not. The bay I could walk to in minutes should be more than enough to cleanse what we say is inside us, the soul. Reflected off the vastness of windows meant to reveal what's inside, this light seems to burn enough to consume the world in fire. This has to be enough to purify the soul and to join everything in this moment in a gesture that blesses it all. And this is the last poem I will read. This is the new one. It's part of a series of poems I'm working on that I call my Thoughts On poems. And obviously, they're meditative poems. And this one is titled Thoughts on Gulls sitting on a let's try that again. Thoughts on goals sitting on a parking lot on a windy below zero day. This awkward construction I call my body and say is mine, is me, that breaks down with age and needs music just to keep moving. It can get in the way sometimes. Snow's expected, it's said. It won't be easy getting around, as much for the cold as the snow. This morning, I feel bad for the gulls, hunkered low, frozen to the lot, their legs tucked under as if lost to the ice. How cold they must be. How cold is it possible to be, and to still need to remember what it meant? A lover's lips touching mine. How different would it feel to be alive in the body of a gull, no matter how cold it was? The air roiling feathers into what could almost be runes, a language both ancient and esoteric, and, with the wind, in flux. As Heraclitus wrote, everything was. He wrote in a language I can't read. Did he ever see gulls hunkered down on stone, an icy wind disturbing their gray feathers into what he thought looked like words? And if he did he start to hum a tune he'd heard a woman play on a lyre the night before? A woman he wanted to kiss while she strummed euphonic strings into the music he was humming as he thought to try to read the wind-roiled feathers of a gull hunkered low to the ground for what warmth the ground had to offer. How much can stone or concrete be able to warm up anybody, even a gull's? How much meaning can the feathers, ruffled by an icy wind of a gull, posit? How variable is the definition of language? How is it possible I can feel so bad for this freezing colony of gulls on this lot almost empty this morning, wanting to bend down to hold one in my hands, as if just that bit of warmth might console a gull enough to make some kind of a difference? If I picked it up and held it to my chest, maybe slipped it under my coat so the sound of my heart might soothe it, would I understand whatever language might be scripted by its feathers in this cold wind? Would those words soothe the aches of this body I can't help but think is on its last legs? Would the gull croon out a song to keep me moving just one more day? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, George. Wow, that was a really beautiful reading. And let's get Doug to join us too, so we can chat for a little bit. So I really want to thank you so much for that reading. And as I've read your poems before in preparation for this, and so hearing them, I read them several times, and hearing them again, starting to feel like friends in a way. And so I wanted to start with a question about, well, I just see that you have a lot of music in your poems, um, and how important music is to you, I gather. Um, and I was so drawn to the poem about the Spanish guitar, and I thought perhaps you could say more about that poem while we're talking just now, and just this the way that the even music played poorly um, is music to forgive everyone who listens. I love that. I love that idea, and I love the whole scene and the setting and the description of these characters that are it's the beauty and the tragedy that you put into that. So yeah, so if you want to talk about that and also what prompted you to write that, like how did you get the idea? Was it um yeah.
Well,
Mhm.
the poem actually began when I was listening to an album by Peter White, who used to play with Al Stewart, but he's now, I guess, he considered a jazz, smooth jazz or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
but he is a wonderful musician, and he plays the Spanish guitar in ways that
Oh,
just amaze me. Um, and so I was listening to, I think it was the Caravan of Dreams album, I think. And I just listening to that Spanish guitar, just the tone of it, just made me feel like I needed to try to, or not try to, I wanted to, I should say, write a poem that essentially moved in some sense, imagistically and narratively, with the way that the music that I was listening to moved. Um, and the image of the mother pulling her child through the fog was just actually a memory from probably about a few months before I was actually working on the first draft of the poem. And so that entered into the poem, and that kind of drove a lot of the quote unquote narrative within the poem.
mhm. Yeah, it's lovely how you yeah, how hearing where you were and what you were doing and what how you were feeling at the time. It's really, really nice to know about that. And I also like how you didn't really say that much about your poems. You let them stand without introducing them very much. So I imagine that's deliberate on your part, but I think that worked
The
really
only, the only,
well.
the only poem that I did say a little bit more was about the one about my father, which is where
Yeah.
the title book comes from. So I just wanted to say a little bit about that, but it also allowed me to talk about briefly what I'm always reminding my students that and these are, we're talking about undergraduate students, the BFA program here. And in fact, right now I'm teaching an ekphrastic workshop. And the reason why I chose to do it this way is that gives them a way out of their own lives. Because I think too often, and I know myself when I was a young writer, too often writers get sort of that navel gazing going on, and they get sort of trapped within their own lives, and they
Yeah.
forget that all art, including poetry, is about transformation. It's not about, my life. It's not about my emotions, my feelings, my attitudes. It has to be something larger than that. And so starting with something that they actually are responding to, I think, gives them a way out of their own sort of little
Lovely.
enclosed lives.
Mhm.
Um, and I think I just lost track of where I was headed with that. Uh,
Oh,
sometimes
you were talking about, yeah, how the music, maybe how the music took you.
Well, yeah, and any other, I think that having literature, as the old saying, literature is an ongoing conversation between the past and the future that takes place in the present. I've always felt like, because I actually started out as a painter. My undergraduate
Oh,
degree is as a painter in visual art, and I've always felt like all the arts should converse more with one another.
mm,
And in
yeah.
terms of music, in terms of visual arts, in terms of sculpture, in terms of dance, I think that all of the bringing elements of all those into poetry, into fiction, I think is actually a good thing to try to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, so Doug, kind of jumped in with a question, but I'd love for you to join us. And
Sure. I
yeah.
was struck when we had a last conversation in preparation for this. You mentioned Larry Levis as a poet that you like, and also a poet that I like a lot. And I don't think it had ever occurred to me until you said that, that I do hear, then I started hearing after you said that some echoes of Larry Levis in your poetry, especially, Phyllis brought up the one
Ew.
about Spanish guitar. That one kind of made me think of kind of the discursive storytelling. And I guess I was wondering how you both deal with this yourself as a writer and how you help students. We've got this sort of challenge that influence is a gift. It can be a wonderful gift for us as writers, and it can also be a terrible danger. And how you kind of balance that between the gift of it and the danger.
Mhm.
Okay, this is interesting. Right now, we just started in my modern poetry class talking about, excuse me, T.S. Eliot's tradition in the individual talent, and of course, that's some of what he's talking about, basically, and that. But I'm also reminded of that what is it? Bad bad writers borrow, good writers steal,
Yeah.
or something like that. But yeah, Elliot is talking about the fact that um, you should what makes a poet really great. And I'm not saying, of course, I'm not great, but what does make a great poet great, he argues, is not so much what is unique about that poet's voice or work or whatever, but how much of the tradition that poet can include in their work. And it's something my students are wrestling with right now, to be honest. But we're still dealing with it in the class. And I'm speechless really about the fact that you're like comparing something I do in one of my poems to Larry Levis. Um, I just think that
Just sit with that, George. Yeah.
I just think that Larry Levis is, I mean, the fact that he died as young as he did was just such a great tragedy. Because I know like what he was actually working on at the end of his turned out to be the end of his life was essentially because like we have Rilke's Duino Elegies, which is I think one of the greatest lyric poems ever written. And then you have Galway Canal's The Book of Nightmares, which is essentially, it is connected obviously to the Duino Elegies. He uses a lot of the same imagery, the repetition of imagery in many of the same ways. It's very unique and different at the same time, but it's also, again, like Eliot says, it's it's playing with something that is already there in the tradition and doing something more with it. And when Larry Levis died, those elegy poems, the elegy with the carnival and all that with Poe, and I can't remember the whole title, but a lot, there's like, I think there's at least 9 in the book Elegy, which are elegy poems. And apparently what he was working on was another sort of redoing of the Duino Elegies. I think David St. John talks about this in, I think, the introduction to the book. Maybe it's the thing after not the introduction, but the post script or whatever it is he has in there. And I just think, my God, what if he had lived long enough to complete that? Just what that
Yeah.
might have. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a great book. Elegy is an amazing book. But it's like we don't have everything that he had sort of at least conceived of in some way.
Yeah.
And I think that's a tragedy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I answered the one of the parts of the question that Doug asked though. But I think I'll
Doug,
stop there.
did you want to follow? Yeah, let's follow up on that, and then we're going to get to your reading. So, did you have any follow up about that, Doug? Or
I guess part of it is, since we both taught a lot of classes, one of the things we certainly can see with students is how sometimes they're negatively influenced by reading poets, and then they're trying to sound just like that poet. And you can just, and then you can also see students who can read a poet and just somehow there's some assimilation where they take some of it but still have their own voice and manage to do that. And I guess I've never quite been able to figure out where that line is and why some students, why reading poems and trying to sound like other poets is so damaging to some people and so helpful to others. I just think it's a complicated relationship. And and you're mentioning the idea of the anxiety of influence. There's also the anxiety that's associated with that we think, oh, am I sounding like this person? Am I not sounding like myself? And so there are all these things that
Right.
that I think go into that when we're writing.
And who am I, right? Like, what is my voice actually? Yeah.
Yeah.
And who is the I that I'm creating on the page?
Mhm.
I think basically it's a matter of time. I think that those, like you're talking about those students that are like they get sort of trapped in trying to mimic the voice of this other poet. But I think given time, they will develop that skill that they acquire in mimicking that voice and make it as a part of their voice. And I'm also I can't help but I can't help but think about Larry Levis's first book, The Wrecking Crew, or is it just Wrecking Crew? It's either that or Wrecking Crew, one of the. And in an interview later in his life, he said that he considered that book to be the work of a poseur, poser, because he felt like those poems were much more in the voice of his professors than his own voice. And it is interesting that oh God, I'm blanking on the second and then third. The third book was something. The Ghost was in the title. I'm blanking on it, but the Afterlife was the second book. And in Afterlife, you can actually see as the book progresses until it gets that last wonderful like extended poem, Linnets, I believe is the title, Linnets. You can see in the poems before that in the book, you can see the mimicking of the older voices starting to sort of like degrade, if you will. And when he hits Linnets in that book, that's the beginning of Larry Levis's like adult voice.
Yeah, just having read, I haven't done this with you, George, because this is my first time meeting you. But with Doug, I've, read some of your earlier poems, not that much earlier, but a few years now. And you can see, right? You can see how the person is developing. And the voice is developing. So I certainly hope to do that with you too, George. Yeah, as you keep on writing, both of you so prolific, which is amazing how you just keep going on like that and just doing it and getting it out. So yeah,
Well,
with that,
sometimes when my students say something like that, I just say, well, when you don't have a life and you don't
yeah,
sleep much,
you said that
that's what
before.
work out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you take that and introduce Doug now? Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I have to read off of this little screen
Cheers.
here,
Yeah.
the first part of this.
Mm-hmm.
So Doug Ramspeck is the author of 9 poetry collections,
Mm-hmm.
2 collections of short stories, and a novella. His most recent poetry book, Blur, which I forgot to bring with me today, received the 10th Gate Prize. Individual poems have appeared in journals that include the Southern Review, the Missouri Review, Kenyon Review, State. That's not State. That's Slate. Slate, the Sun, and the Georgia Review. A magazine that I could only get an essay in. I've never been able to get a poem in. His author website can be found at, okay, I don't know, DougRamspeck.com. It's just, one word, right? A retired professor of English, lucky guy. He taught for more than 20 years on the Lima campus of the Ohio State University. He lives now with his wife near the top of a mountain in western North Carolina with bears as neighbors. And this is actually from an introduction that I did for Doug when he read here. In his poems, Doug Ramspeck makes it clear he is on what used to be called a first name basis with the world we all live in. And he presents us with the familiar world in ways that are not only unfamiliar, but which serve to remind us of one of the oldest truths, that the physical world, the sensual world, the world we live in and love in, that we walk through daily and dream of and in at night, is, as Yeats argued it is, a manifestation of the spiritual, and has more to offer us than just bodily sustenance. The world, as we come to know it in Doug Ramspeck's poetry, a world experienced fully through articulation, can in fact sustain the soul. Doug Ramspeck.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate that. I think that most poets are somewhere between these two extremes that I'm going to describe. But from talking to a lot of poets and from talking to a lot of students over the year, poetry students over the years, I do think that you can kind of put it out as way of thinking about is there are some poets on one extreme or the other in terms of how they write. You do have one group of poets, I think, who are really they have an idea of what they want to say before they begin, whether it's an idea or an experience. Oftentimes it is based on something true. And this is sort of up there and they have the vision of it. And the writing process then becomes, how do they get there? How do they get from where they are to that place that they're imagining and that they envisioned beforehand? And this often takes multiple drafts, sort of going through again and again, trying to reach that place that they've envisioned before they begin. And again, I think that is a lot of way that some poets write. I think there are other poets who have a sort of a different method, who write more blindly, who don't have that thing they're imagining before they begin about where they're going. They're uncertain of the destination. They follow a voice or a vague feeling, often the sense of just more listening to what the poem has to say rather than trying to aim the poem in a certain direction. In other words, poets who do that are more inclined to let the poem create itself. Again, most poets are somewhere between the two. For myself, I'm way over on the side of letting the poem decide. I try, in fact, intentionally when I write, to not know where I'm headed. One of the things I really like to do is to come up with the title for the poem first, before I have any idea what the poem is going to be about. And then the first thing I try to do when I begin the poem is to make sure that the opening lines have nothing to do in my mind with that title. And so that part of what has to happen in the process for me of writing is I need to sort of discover why that's the title. Rather than knowing why it's a title and trying to reach it, I'm trying to discover it. And that's really how I write books as well. I don't really plan them out. I sort of start with something, some kind of small kernel, and then let things sort of branch out from there. So with Blur, which I'll be reading a few poems from, it really began with a thought that I had about two feral boys, two young boys who spent all their time sort of outdoors, not particularly civilized in many ways, as some young boys, that is an apt description of them. I was one of those boys when growing up. I think my mother thought that I would never live to adulthood because I was always doing sort of crazy, violent things and getting myself injured in a wide variety of ways. And so I imagined a book about two brothers who sort of were wild in terms of a lot of those things. And I didn't know why I thought of that or why I wanted to write a book that began with that, but it occurred to me, so I began writing poems based on it. And one of the first poems I wrote was called Moon Sonnet. And I remember actually waking up in the middle of the night and just imagining these two boys throwing stones at the moon. And so I started with that, and I suspect I tend to write early, get up early, write early. So I imagine that I probably wrote this poem very early in the morning, probably before it was light out. Moon Sonnet. The boys throw stones at the moon inside their dreams and slit the moon's throat, drag the carcass to the earth and drown it in the river. And the moon says, let me hold you in my arms. And the boys say, you will bleed dark blood from your underbelly. And the boys imagine smashing a stone to the moon's skull. And the moon says, I was hung by the neck in the sky. And the boys want to pluck out the moon's lone eye, want to bury the moon in the sky's loam. And the moon reaches down with its soft hands, and the moon says, hush, hush. And the brothers dream that they can carry the moon in their pockets, drop it from the quarry, hear it splash into the black. And the boys say to the moon, please come down and stay with us. And the moon says to the boys, this is my body. And the boys roll over in their sleep, and the boys are restless in their dreams, and the boys long to burn the moon to ash. So again, I began at first just writing a lot of poems about these boys, probably way too many poems about these two sort of feral boys was the way I imagine it. And again, oftentimes one of the methods I like to use in writing any poem was to come up with the title first. So I came up with a title, There Is Inside the Brothers a Trajectory. So before I began, I had no idea what that trajectory was. So I wrote the poem to try to find out what that trajectory might possibly be. There is inside the brothers a trajectory of letting go, something hardening into flung stone, some hollowing at the center of their bones. Or maybe the years are shriveled creatures, and the boys are the entrails of the bullfrog they saw once squashed flat on the raised road. And the brothers studied the dead grass at the road's edge, and that dead grass studied the boys leaning down. And once they hanged the neighbor's cat and buried it. And the cat said, here is my alluvium. And the boys said, the years are a lunar tug. And they spoke some nights of how the stars invented themselves as gritty sand, and how all longing was epileptic, some inward thrashing. But mostly they aimed themselves out in one direction, and that direction said, every night is a black tongue. And the boys said, this is my nocturne. Then the morning slit the night's throat and made it bleed. Again, another poem that I know that I came up with the title first was entitled Dream of the 10 Rivers. And I think I wrote the poem to figure out why in the world there were 10 rivers. I don't think I ever figured it out in the poem, but there you go. That was the title. It had to stay because that's where it began. The boys summon vultures like bedclothes, wear them in their sleep, wear them to wade into the dark current of the night. And so their father unfolds his wings inside their dreams, and a wreckage of darkness gathers with a heartless fire until the brothers exist almost wholly inside wariness, inside boy smells, and they acquiesce to the dreamed hand lashing toward them, to the caress of fists, to the blood taste in the mouth. And the story they tell is of wildfire, of 10 rivers, the water spreading outward like fingers on a hand, rivers of numerology. Or they tell the story of the blind prophet who sees only that there is no way out, that the years are waxen ghosts. Or they sit with their father at the kitchen table, sit with their father on the porch, sit with their father in his truck, until sitting becomes a kind of prayer, until the silence of their voices is a kind of prayer. And the vultures draw the pink entrails from the carcasses, conjure perfect strings of them, strings to tie around fingers in remembrance. And the brothers want to swim with their father in the current, to be their father in the current, and also to be the vultures with their shaved heads. And when it snows in winter, the brothers will skate the 10 rivers with sharp blades, blades that draw blood from the ice, and their father will come to them in their dreams, will crack the surface with heavy boots, will whisper comfort as he holds them fast beneath. So part of what began to happen as I was writing the poems about the Farrell brothers was more members of this family began to appear. So in this poem, poems about the father began to appear. So I began writing many more poems about the father. And then I began writing poems about other members of the family, including a snow prophecy that focuses on the mother. Mother imagines that the snowflakes falling behind the house are her children, and the snow hardening into a carapace of skin is a kind of long division, the ears existing in the backs of her teeth, in a throb in her molars, in some raw patch of her tongue, or maybe her children are the sticky eggs of stars embedded in the sky's mud, or the trees in the woods shed not only their leaves but their bark, stripped to bare bone. And when she was younger, she imagined that a body growing inside another body might come to seem like prophecy. And she imagined something holy in the blood of giving birth, something sacrificial. But now she wonders if her sons and her daughter are more like smoke or mist, not a plinth, but constructed out of visions and winter snows. And she suspects that the years are something you might catch in an outstretched palm, and the filial devotion of the sky makes her breaths living formations all around her. So again, I began writing more and more poems about all the various members of this family. And oftentimes what I try to do when I write a poem, or if I come up with a title first, I will like to open a book at random. And the first word I see, then I decide will be somewhere in the title. I like to do the same thing in the writing of poems. If I feel that I get stuck, I'll open a book at random, and the first word I see will appear in the next line. And for me, this unlocks that unconscious part of things where I'm not taking control over where the poem is going. The poem is deciding where it's going, and that is really helpful for me to write. I've often thought that I'm a lousy writer, but I'm an okay listener. So the next poem is called Family Anthem. Sister believes her brothers are the brackish waters of the river, are the possum face of the moon, and she believes that dusk light congeals inside their throats. Once she saw them set fire to the neighbor's cat, saw them dance around the flames, and she dreamed that night that their teeth crumbled in their mouths like stones, that the stars were kicked over and abandoned, and she believes that the years have soot-black tongues, that her brothers have soot-black tongues, and the songs they sing spill bitter salt into the world. Once she might have smothered them in their cribs, might have dropped them like anthems from windows. Once she watched them swim beneath a canker sore of sun, and she thought, let the mud waters carry them away, carry them under. And she dreamed that night that they were standing by her bed, were carefully dousing her with lighter fluid, and they said, we anoint you. And she said, stop. And they said, we baptize you. And she said, you are not my brothers. And they said, hush, hush. Again, most of these poems I don't consider autobiographical, but I did torment my sister when I was a little boy. I still owe her many apologies for the kinds of torment I inflicted upon her. I began to wonder too, as I was writing, as I began producing more poems for the book, where exactly these poems were taking place. So again, I started writing far too many poems that had the word Midwest in them. And one of these, this is the one that Phyllis mentioned. The Midwest hangs itself while listening to bobolinks. And the birds know how to slow a lifetime's hands, how grass is not a quickness, but a history. And once the Midwest dreamed an epistle of moonlight above the quiet houses. And once the Midwest made a religion out of the cadences of loam, though the skeletal remains of the factories still wait amid the broken glass, still hold themselves aloof in that same forgetful abeyance. And the Midwest studies how the stars after dark are open wounds, how legs thrash before the toes point down. But here, now, there is something holy in a bobolink, holy in the spiral staircase of dusk, leading up and up to nowhere, in the claw grip of the clouds, and the sudden drop like a souvenir. The more I began writing, I think about all of these characters, I began then thinking about, well, what happened to them when they got older? What happened to these feral brothers as they uh, became adults? So I began sort of imagining them and oftentimes beginning to write sometimes in first person about them. And one of the poems I produced thinking about that was entitled "The Marriage We Carried in Our Pockets." Or sometimes watched drifting with the leaves, some last confetti of yellow or brown, or it existed the way the juncos huddle beneath the thistle feeder in winter, the way clouds spilled water in May to soak the ground. Once we found it in the attic in a steamer trunk, and another time we closed it in a suitcase and drove it across the countryside. And often we imagined that the years were a locked door against which we kept knocking to be admitted. And on the dresser of the new house, I spilled the change of the marriage into a heap. And later we sat on the back porch and watched the nuptial clouds on their conveyor belts. And we slept at night with the breaths of the marriage around us. So I began thinking more and more about some of these feral boys as being adults. I began thinking about sort of the writing in retrospect, looking back over a lifetime, over years. And I do think I become deeply influenced by being surrounded now by mountains. And so I wrote a poem entitled "Divining the Mountain." And this will be the last one I'll read from the book. For years I have studied the ebb tide of evening drifting along the distant ridge. Little changes on the mountain except the spells of rain and sun and mist and snow. And it seems possible to dream the slow pirouette of seasons, the sacred freight of years. One summer, a neighbor girl was struck by a school bus along the mountain's base and died. And 2 springs later, my wife had her miscarriage, the cortex of stars appearing like so many bees humming around the mountain's hive. The road beyond our house is often overrun with weeds, and we see the teenagers come summer lying on their blankets by the river. The sky beyond the mountains plants the bulbs of longing deep, and the clouds at dusk appear like bits of burning leaves shriveling at their edges. And after the rains each year, the sky is a secret room. We come from alluvium, I believe, and listen to the canopy of trees conversing with the wind. Let us be carried now, I sometimes think. Let the cadence moon lie down. And my wife and I walk sometimes along the bottom of the mountain. It seems there are holes in the hours, what slips through. And if it is night, we speak of the wafer-thin starlight on the ridge, and we recall the leech that once affixed itself to the soft of my wife's ankle when we waded in the river, and the blood of dawn when we walk into early light is always rapture. And one morning we come across a cluster of trillium not far from the river's blank, the white mouths open as though to swallow ghosts. So I do think that that is the only way that I can kind of write a book, which is to kind of imagine sort of start in some little kernel of something, and then sort of branch out and kind of see where it goes from there. And I'll read one final poem that is actually the basis of the next book. And it's a poem that I wrote that really everything else in the book is flowing out of this poem. It's called Smoke Memories. My mother and I were alone the night our house burned down. I was 9 that summer, and the smell of smoke clung to my clothes. And after the fire, a tree in the yard grew crooked with scoliosis, its back bent in the remains of the house. The years that followed took on a winding cadence, a torsional writhing, like a ghost snake muscling on its belly through tall grass. And when I married, I knew that my memories were made of smoke. And some days I spoke to the river and to the stillness of the trees, and after our son was born, I believed that to touch his bare feet to a first snow of the season would keep him safe, that seeing a white horse in a dream would portend that I might die. And some days I stood on our back porch and studied the way the empty fields offered their sorrowful soliloquies. And my wife asked about that childhood crooked tree, and I described how I would climb it every time my father returned us to the ruins and assigned blame. And I described for my wife how my mother and I would sit sometimes at the back of my bedroom closet while she smoked, how other times we escaped outside to hide behind the tree while smoke swirled its forgetfulness around us, and how that night while my father was out, she touched the tip of one of the cigarettes to the living room curtains, then returned to sit beside me on the couch. Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Doug. That was a beautiful, beautiful reading. And I know everyone here is really appreciating both of you and George. So let me start with well, gosh, you uh, the trillium. I was just it's wildflower season now here already. Not to make you East Coasters feel too bad, but there's the wildflowers, the trillium, and the opening its mouth. It just really spoke to me at the end of that poem. And actually, all of the last lines of your poems are so amazing, where they, like you say, where they end up. I'm just really reflecting on how you talked about your process. So is the idea of starting with the title of the poem, is that new for you, or have you always done it that way?
Well, I do think that, and we talked about this before, but I think a lot of this for me came out of the fact that I had many years of writer's block that was
Yeah.
terrible, and that I found that,
Yeah.
that writing consciously meant that I could not write at all. I mean, I have an MFA that I received in my upper 20s, and then I really didn't write until I turned 50, and then I began writing poetry. And I really began writing because I changed the way I did it. And I do it this way, not because I do it because I have to, because it's the only way I can actually produce work. And so for me, I do think that from the beginning, when I started writing poetry at 50, I've always done some variation in this. It's not all, I don't always come up with a title first, but it's some variation on letting the poems where they go, and trying to strip away as much of the conscious part of the writing as possible. And there are a lot of ways you can do that, and to really try to write without taking control over it. I really try to imagine, I really like to think of myself as an amanuensis, that I'm just listening and writing down what I'm hearing, and I'm not creating anything.
Yeah, you were saying there's many ways to do that. Can you tell us a little bit more about your process that way, or is it just not you can't really talk about it in a way because it's so intuitive?
I do think for me, it's writing fast. It's the slower I go, the weaker the writing is. Usually the faster I'm going, usually is when the writing is better. I try to write a first draft of a poem really as quickly as I can type. I mean, I'm typing as fast as I can to get through it. That's one way you can sort of write out of the unconscious mind. That's not to say I'm done that, because one of the things I like to do is one of my favorite ways of writing recently is to write 4 poems absolutely as quickly as I can. And those 4 poems, as near as I can tell, have nothing to do with each other. And then I try to take those 4 poems and put them into one poem. And for me, again, that it's just, I'm not writing it, I'm just trying to find connections. I'm now looking at these 4 poems and trying to see connections and trying to figure out, just pull out the best lines and try to figure out how those lines can work together. Um, I do think
Yeah.
that for me, George mentioned the idea of basing it on something outside yourself, whether it's a
Mhm.
painting or whether it's a song or something of that sort. I find things useful to me as well. The poems I'm reading or writing to are not particularly autobiographical. Maybe they do reflect things about my life. For example, I don't have a brother. So I wrote all these poems about a brother I don't have. I wrote an entire book about a brother I don't have. So it is, but I do think it reflects certain things, obviously, that are coming out of my experiences. But it's helpful to me to try not to write about things that have actually happened to me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. What I'd like to do is ask people in the audience, including George, uh, if your writing process is anything like what Doug is talking about, is it totally different? Like, how do you approach it? And is there anything, that you hear these two readers talking about that you might want to try? So, I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that. George, do you want to first? And then we'll see
First
if
of all,
anybody wants
can
to
you
speak
hear me?
also. Yeah,
Okay, I wasn't sure if I was. Um,
you're good.
okay. Um, a lot of what you were talking about as you were reading through those poems made me think of something that, and I'm not sure where I first read this, but I know that I've basically repeated it over the years to students. Excuse me. That, and especially your idea about you're a good listener, right? You're a good listener. And I'm telling my students that language is more experienced, older, smarter, knows more, even a young language like the English language, than any of them do. And that if they can find ways to hear what language can tell them, that they'll write better poems. Um, and for me at least, and listening to your poems, especially in your voice, and I had the same feeling back at your reading here. There is this wonderful tension in your work between these narrative, descriptive kind of passages, and then these phrases that are just sort of taking apart the normal way we think of the thing we've just been sort of shown briefly, right? And so these phrases and you said something about you just sometimes when you're saying when you pick up a book, you open it up and you just find
Mhm.
take a word where, and it struck me that that's some of what I think I'm hearing in those particular phrases that
Right.
they're connected to the sort of the natural literal descriptions sort of things going on, but they take it somewhere else completely.
Mhm.
And then the poems that allow that otherness to sort of take the poem like you were saying, where you did not know it was headed. Um, and I told my students, like listening to the sounds of the words that they have already used. Hugo talks about in the Triggering Town. I can't remember the exact number, but I'll say it's 8. I think it was 8, where he says that he early on he decided that when he wrote a sound he particularly liked, within 8 syllables, he would have an echo of that sound. And then he says something like, "Why 8? Don't because don't even bother to ask.
So, yeah,
It's
so
silly.
George,
You just
yeah.
do it.
So George, yeah, well, how about you? Like, what's your process like? Do you relate to what Doug is saying? You
Yes,
before we
very
got
much
on,
so.
you said something about I don't really have an unconscious anymore. And Doug said, well, I'm totally unconscious. So yeah, so tell us more about your
There,
process.
I'm actually. I mean, okay. I think I'm maybe a little bit more to the other direction on the spectrum, if you will.
Yeah.
But I do have poems that start out of something that has either happened to me happened to somebody I know, that I've read about in the news. I read the paper every day. Sometimes things come out of that. I used to say that the world, was it Stafford, William Stafford, something about the world is our only friend. It gives us everything, or something like that. And he also had that idea of like he would get up in the morning, he would just like sit and like listen to the beginning of the day, and then he would just start writing from whatever sort of jumped into his awareness out of that. And I think, again, listen, like you were saying, listening is so absolutely central, and listening to not only what is being said but how it's being said, and being aware of the different direction that how it's being said can take what is being, or what has been being said, where it can take it. And that makes me think of Levis too, I guess, actually.
So we have a comment here from Christy saying in the chat, saying, I love it when poets and writers can describe the thing. And you said there are two ends of the spectrum of writing, vision led versus allowing the poem to lead, but then not being afraid of allowing the poem to take a turn. Yeah, so I don't know, Christy, if you want to say anything more about that, like you talking about describing things.
No, I think it's really great when poets can kind of, or writers can really describe their process, because I think we kind of attune our process to being personal. And then when we can share that our process is actually kind of universal, it kind of helps make a, I don't know, it can make a connection between reader and poet, etc. And I was just making that comment that I really appreciate it when writers are capable of sharing that.
Thank you.
Christy, I wanna add to that. But I want to step outside of poetry for a moment in order to do so. Raymond Carver has an essay titled On Writing. And one of the things he talks about in that essay, Flannery O'Connor was in the same class or whatever at Iowa that Carver was. And he talks about reading, I forget which essay it is in Mystery and Manners, but it's one of the essays in Mystery and Manners, where she talks about writing, okay, I always think it's Good Country People. I always confuse it with A Good Man Is Hard to Find. Good Country People. That's the one, right, where the Bible salesman steals the wooden leg of the PhD woman after they have their encounter in the loft. That's have I got the right title? I think that's the right title. But anyway, she's talking about in this essay that she did not know that the Bible salesman was going to steal her wooden leg until a sentence before she wrote the sentence where it happens. But Carver says that one of the more important things is what she says right after that, right? Which is, as soon as she realized that that's what he was going to do, she realized also that it had been inevitable, right? That the whole story basically had been moving her in that direction. And then Carver responds in his essay, says, I was so happy to read that in this this essay by a writer who I really admire. He says, because I had been afraid that I was the only one who wrote that way. That it was, I thought I was the only one who had no idea where the story was going, what it was, what was going to happen, what was going to be about, what, all that. And I thought there was something wrong with me. And he says, reading that is like, oh great, I am a writer.
I do have to say one thing though, in defense of the other part of the spectrum, is I have known very good, extremely good poets who write endless drafts and who have this vision before they begin of what they want the poem to be, and it is, you revise until you get there. I can't do that, but I have known poets who really outstanding poets write that way. So it's not as though there's sort of one answer to this or one way to write. There are all different kinds of ways to get there, and I think part of figuring out what you want to part of figuring out what it means to be a writer is figuring out what is the method that really does work for you.
It allows you to get to your voice,
Yeah.
your vision.
That's right. Whatever that is, right? Yeah. Well, gosh, there's so many different ways we could go. So much to talk about. And I'd like to spend a little more time with the two of you, so I hope that'll be okay. So yeah, I don't, does anyone else, let's see, if anyone else has any thoughts or comments, please do put them in the chat or raise your hand. And in the meantime, I'm gonna ask Doug about this poem that the Midwest hangs itself, just because I was so fascinated by that poem, and I don't need you to tell me what it means exactly. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but I don't know if you want to, but or maybe you don't know. But I guess I just had this when I was looking at it, it just feel like the Midwest was a character in the novel, a depressed character trying to find holiness, and then at the end, the sudden drop like a souvenir. I felt like that was the drop of the person hanging themselves. So, and so you had the title. You started with the title, is that right?
Yes, I
And where
probably
did the
did. I don't
modeling
remember for
start?
sure, but I probably did.
Yeah, I mean, so okay. Anything you want to say about it? Yeah, please just indulge me.
I I did live for 21 years in Lima, Ohio, which is in Western Ohio. And
Mhm.
it is to give you some context, it's the representative from that area is Jim Jordan. It's a very conservative,
Okay.
um, I, there was nothing, everywhere around our house, there were nothing but Trump signs. And, this was constant.
All right.
And I do think that you wonder to a certain extent, what happens is that um, I did have the feeling that there was some sense of resentment that takes place in the Midwest. And I'm sure a lot of it is that the failing factories, uh, like the middle class, the hollowing out of the middle class,
Mhm.
harder and harder to sort of make a living in the Midwest. And I do think that sort of engendered some of the feeling of kind of a hopelessness. And yet, you say that, but I'm not trying to say something negative about. I adored the people who lived there. Were wonderful
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
and lots of really good friends, lots of people that I absolutely fantastic student. I have nothing negative in any way, shape, or form to say about this. And the students I had there, they were fantastic.
Mhm.
But I do think that I did feel kind of a feeling of a sort of a pressure there, and sort of a desire for kind of a dignity, a desire for um, and so that idea just seemed kind of apt to me, about the idea of the Midwest feels a little bit like it's been hanged. And so that's sort of where I
Mhm.
sort of went with that, I suppose.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, thanks. That's really lovely to hear more of the context of it. And you don't need it either, right? So, but it's nice to hear it.
I had a question for George, and I do know that I've done some of this too, but not as much as you have, where you write across genres, where you've written novel, novella, poetry, and I'm wondering short stories. I'm wondering if you feel that it is the same process, or do you feel like you have to put on a different hat when you're doing those different genres, or do you feel like they're connected, or that they feel very different to you? Yet are they different skills, or how do you approach the different genres?
Yeah, that's actually a tough question for me, at least. Um, I guess I'm kind of the what Pound once said that poetry must, and this is a paraphrase, but poetry must be at least as well written as good prose. Um, for
Mhm.
in some way, I think that it's what the the only term I can think of, the project that you're kind of feel compelled to follow at the time helps to determine the form, was it form is nothing more than an expression of content, right? I think that there is something about what you're trying to do is going to move you either to verse or prose or a novel, novella, stories, whatever. But in the end, I guess it's for me, it's just the writers that I most admire in prose and in poetry. Maybe that's not the right, was it? Fiction and poetry and nonfiction. Are those who you can tell when you read them that whatever else you might say, the sentence is everything. I know in poetry you have the one thing you have that you don't have in prose, is you have the line. But it's what the line can do in concert with the sentence. And I guess I'm stumbling with this because the one novel that I did, which is I think now, I mean, you've got collection of stories, right? You've got novella. You haven't yet published a novel, right?
No.
Okay. Are you working on one?
Yes.
But okay.
But it's harder for me because that is more of a conscious process.
Yes, exactly. But it was hard for me too, and in fact, I will never write another novel. But the one novel that I did write, I think I was only able to write because I had this construct in which I could deal in very small portions. Right? I had these 6 different voices, and each one of them talks, I think, in the novel 3 times, I think. And so I was able to like keep focused on, well, this voice is speaking, right now in terms of this. And so I don't have to worry about how am I going to get this story to like fit into whatever. There was still that discovery process, the not knowing completely where things are going. And in fact, the novel actually got like listed as in addition to Larry or whatever, it's a mystery novel, which I really loved because actually it is a mystery, at least on some level, that is never. In fact, I mean, the question of these babies burning up in their cribs in this small town, which is actually Bowling Green, Ohio. But it's never really complete. You're never really completely sure what the final answer is as to what's been going on.
Wow.
But I like to think that there's enough in the little segments as you go through it that, in fact, you can, in fact, reach a similar conclusion as everybody else, kind of thing.
Mm. Well, that's really amazing. And
I'm glad to know you're working on a novel.
yeah, I was going to say that too. So that sounds like a really cool novel. Did that come out a while ago, George? Or
Yeah, that was I don't it was a long time ago. Now it seems
Yeah.
like came out from Leapfrog Press that won their
Yeah.
fiction
So
award or whatever.
I had a couple more questions I thought we could try to squeeze in, and then if anyone else, I'm still gonna ask you if anyone else in the audience has a question or a comment. But let me just let me so George, I wanted to know, the question I had for you was when you have a book, do you write the poems that are going to go in the book, kind of like Doug does it? Or and the structure of how you put the book together. So are you choosing poems that you've already written that you're fitting in, or do you write the poems for this one, I guess, for this latest one, the acrobatic?
Well, what I was going to say in general is that I've done it differently with different books.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have a manuscript right now, which it's not published yet and not been really accepted yet anywhere. It's been a finalist in some contests, but but it's actually every poem in it. The title of the poem is a fragment of Heraclitus's On Nature. Um,
Wow.
and each of the poems was written to the how would you say this, the under the audio influence of two particular Frank Sinatra albums, both of which he's singing with the Nelson Riddle Orchestra, and
Cool.
one in particular is probably his. It's like was right after the breakup with and it's gone. Then her name is she's an actress. I can't now her
Oh,
name.
Frank Sinatra, you mean?
Yeah,
I don't
uh,
know.
I can't remember right now, but there's a real there's like a despair and a darkness and whatever, and yet there's
Mm,
this amazing beauty as well.
that is so cool. Yeah.
And so like the
Yeah.
poems have that kind of connection.
Yeah. How about
Um,
in the Acrobat book?
the Acrobatic Company of the Invisible, it has several different threads that kind of
Mhm.
run through it.
And did you write them all for the book or did you have them?
Yes, yeah.
So yeah.
It was something I was working towards. I had no idea exactly how it was going to fit together as I was working on the individual poems. But once
Mhm.
I had a good number of them, then I started to see that there were, as I said, there's like four four major kind of threads
Mm,
that run through it. And some
mhm,
of the poems contain more than one thread. Others focus on one
mm. And
specifically.
that is the beauty of a book of poetry. And I guess, and novels too, where you're weaving things together and then as you read it, the reader is discovering all that. Yeah. So Fred writes in the wee small hours Sinatra. Does that help?
Yes, and the
Yeah.
Wee Swallows is one of them. Yes, yes, yeah.
Okay, here's another question from Christy. George, how do you read your poems without crying? Because as a listener and a reader, I can't stop crying. That's a really great concern.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that. I think it's in an essay by Yeats where he says something like the actress who plays Cleopatra, uh, doesn't cry because if she did, it would ruin the scene, the moment, and the
Mm,
like that fourth wall, I guess, whatever.
mhm,
And and that's at the same point where he says something like, or right after that, he says something like, "No one has continued throughout, hundreds of years, thousands of years, or some things, like to read." I think he mentioned specifically like Lear, King Lear by Shakespeare. And nobody has continued to read Lear because of the pain and the suffering and the sorrow. They've continued to read it because of the beauty
beauty,
of the
right.
writing, beauty of the
Mhm,
form. Um, and I think that I when I'm reading, even like the one for my father, which is probably the one she's thinking about,
mhm.
um, when I'm reading it, I'm I'm not thinking about my father. I'm thinking about the poem. I'm trying to present the words on the page, and so I'm not thinking about the fact that it actually is. And I don't really, as and I think Doug, you mentioned this. I don't actually like ever, almost never write something into my poems that's really like directly out of my own life. I use aspects of my life, but
Mhm,
they're transformed. And that poem and a couple others in the book about my father, there's one about his funeral, for instance, later in the book.
mhm.
Those poems actually are they're much more sort of connected to my actual
Yeah.
experience, which is why I
Yeah.
said, I mentioned the Stephen Dunn thing. That's why they have to be, at least in part, fictive. He says the more personal the poem, the more it has to be fictive. Uh,
Mm.
and I think he was right about that.
You mean you mean the more you have to make it into fiction to make it a good
Yeah, yes,
poem?
it has to be fictive
Yeah.
because otherwise, again, you run the risk of forgetting about the fact that what you're doing is you're
Yeah.
writing a poem, you're
Yeah.
making art, which is
Yeah.
transformative. And if you're focused too much on, okay, well, this was my feeling at the time, this is my experience,
Mhm.
you kind of lose that connection to the art. I think
Mm.
that's been my experience.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really
Well,
interesting. It's
Doug? How do
good to
you?
think about.
What do you think? Because you were mentioning how you didn't have a brother, but you were dealing with things that you have kind of dealt with yourself.
Yeah, the setting is not, for example, out of my childhood. I grew up in a northern suburb of Chicago. It was not rural at all, suburban. Um, but I do think that living all those years in Ohio, and we lived outside of town, the that began to sort of seep into me as something I wanted to include in the writing. And I do think that I write a lot about the father. The father doesn't come across very well in this book. My father was not violent, but he was difficult. And so, you know, I do think some of those things just seep in. They're part of it. But it's again, I'm not sitting down trying to write about my life. It's just somehow whenever you're writing, those things are going to come
You
in.
can't, right. You can't keep them out, really, especially if you're using the unconscious. It's going to come in, yeah.
I
Which,
did think, you know, like in the one poem that the mother's kind of beleaguered when my um I'm going to tell this story. When my parents divorced, my father came home and said that he was going to leave her for another woman, and he was going to go on a vacation with her. And my mother had always packed his suitcases whenever he went on a trip. And so
oh
she
God,
packed his suitcase for this trip because
that's,
she didn't want him to leave. God knows
oh,
why. And you know, it's just so I do think that idea of sort of the beleaguered
mm,
life of this certainly is something that I connected to with my mother. She was much happier after she didn't want my father to leave, but she was much happier after he did.
oh
Um,
wow, what a
and so I
story.
do think that that is something that seeps into the writing, but it wasn't something I thought about. I'm trying to write about that or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Well, you know, I was going to say to you that your this book of yours and probably all and many of your books, I don't know about, I haven't read all of them, but I'd like to, but it is that they do seem like novels in a way. These poetry books, because they are stories. And they have a thread. I mean, it's obviously not a novel, but it has a feeling of a novel. And you have these characters that aren't, they're infused with parts of you, but they're different characters. So, um, and then, and I've been reading, is it Kaveh Akbar? Is that how you say his name? Um, he just came out with a novel. And so I've been reading that. And so that's what he did is he took so it's kind of memoirish. It's not really, it's not a memoir, but there's a lot of his life in there. So his main character is a poet from Iran who has an alcoholism and drug problem. So but so I just thought, well, that it's interesting that, he's doing it that way. You're doing your poems that way. And I don't know, you might want to look at that book to give you some ideas about a
Is it
novel.
Martyr?
Yes, Martyr. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so fascinating. I think poets who write novels I think you've got an edge, really. It just in terms of all of the ways that you can use language and the skill that you already have. Um, so I find it really interesting to read, just thinking about, well, yeah, and then I've looked at his poems too, and it's just interesting to see how you can morph all that from one genre to another. But yeah, I really do. I don't know, George, what do you think? Do you think that Doug's poetry is books are a little bit like novels that
Well, I certainly think Blur is, has
Mhm,
basically has a similar kind of construction, I guess, whatever.
mhm.
But personally, as I said, I'm looking forward to his novel.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
I wouldn't hold your breath.
yeah. So, what I thought
I'll keep breathing long enough that maybe.
so yeah, I thought that the poems that were in the first person in your book, Doug, were actually you, the poems about the marriage. And I really kind of liked it. I didn't know that, anyway, it doesn't matter. That's just how I saw it. But I thought, oh, this book is so amazingly blended together with, real life stories and then made up stories. And so it's interesting that those were actually fiction also, thinking about those characters growing up.
I do, one of the things that, again, that I think about with that is that I'm really interested in the idea of memory as a writer. And so the idea that, I do think that a lot of the poems that I have written recently have been about that, have been about sort of the distortions of memory, sort of the hopefulness of memory, which is sort of an odd thing to say. But I do think that it's, and that was the poem you're mentioning, I think, was the one that was really, to me, a lot about memory.
Yeah, well, let's see if there's anything else. Well, so we also got from, oh gosh, Fred tells us that it was Ava Gardner in the Frank Sinatra.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for
I don't know
that.
why I blanked on her name.
Yeah, there you go. Well, gosh, well, I love that you're both teachers and how that has really infused our conversation. And I was having this wish that I could have been in your class, could be in your class, George, could have been in your class, Doug. So I know your students really have appreciated everything that you bring to them, and you brought so much to a reading based on all the knowledge that you have as teachers and working poets. And so I just want to thank you both so much. It's been really amazing having you. And I think we talked about closing, a couple of closing poems, and yeah, we're getting a lot of applause and um, uh, from the audience. Yeah, thank you. There's a thank you from Sarah. So do you want to, did we talk about closing? I think we did, yeah. So yeah, why don't we do that, and then
Want to just do it
we'll
in the same
finish it for tonight.
order that we read, or different order? I mean, I don't care. I do have a very short poem.
Yeah, Doug,
I
why
do
don't
too.
you go first this time, and then George can finish us, take
Okay,
us out.
this is the final poem from Blur. And again, it's very short. And to me, this is about memory. Winter Trance. I have been studying the migration of the years, the dull heat of their passage, a strange fire. And because they are holy, gravity slips through them. These cycles of sleeping and waking, as quiet as the space between heartbeats. The stillness of January fields, the men by the fence at the roadside in their orange jumpsuits, the winter crows oaring out of the trees.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead, George.
Mine is another one of those decadent poems. And this one is titled Before All Hell Breaks Loose. Exhausted, it's not too dense, the chaos of morning grackle chatter. All language is a question of perspective, meaning at times too much to ask for. Nothing less than a rude babble of birdsong torches the shrubs, igniting another last day before all hell breaks loose. I've heard it said, we're living in the end times. Try telling the grackles, the weary world's winding down. Music's a language that says time won't end.
Wow. So
Great line on which to end, right?
yes, exactly. Is that Carolyn?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the two readers. And next time we'll have Shannon and Helena will be with us. So really looking forward to that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everybody.
Great.
All right, thank you
Night.
so much,
Thank
Philip.
you.
Thank